All right, Lauren DesRosiers joins us now. Lauren, we appreciate your time. Obviously, a lot to get to here. I know the last time we talked, you wanted to get more into due process. I guess what aspects of it, I know it's a bit of a broad term at that, but what are you seeing when it comes to the due process conversation at this point and where it's being adjudicated and maybe where it's not?
Yeah, I think due process is a big issue across various parts of the law, so criminal justice and immigration as well. And there's a very complicated jurisprudence around that. So the case decisions going back the past 150 years. But right now, one of the things that's kind of most pressing is the shortcut around due process that we're seeing with a lot of people who are being arrested for immigration violations or alleged immigration violations who have very little opportunity to contest the arrest or the the deportation before they are actually deported. In particular, this is happening with people who may have some sort of limited protection. So, for instance, withholding of removal or protection under the Convention Against Torture. Um, those are kind of like asylum. You don't need to worry too much about the kind of details of it, but they're very similar to asylum. So the idea is we don't, as an international community, don't want to return people to a country where they will be tortured. That is not a good thing. Nobody should want that. And so the qualifications for those kind of protections um, are similar to asylum, and they're often adjudicated in an immigration court context at the same time as asylum. Uh, those protections only apply to the country where the person is from. And so what we're seeing a lot of right now is third country removals. So for instance, somebody can't be removed to Honduras, but that doesn't mean there's not an order in place. There's not an immigration judge order in place saying that they can't be removed to South Sudan, right? And so the turnaround time on what's happening between arrest and then actual deportation to a third country has been very quick. And recently, there's been the due process, an opportunity to contest that deportation um, has been has been curtailed. So that's kind of one of the things that we're seeing a lot of. Um, Due process is a really important concept because if it doesn't apply to everybody, it doesn't apply. So, for instance, if you are arrested by ICE and you are a U.S. citizen, which does happen, I think yesterday there was an incident or an announcement for a U.S. citizen who was an Army vet in California. He had been arrested by ICE and held for 3 days. And that's not that uncommon. And luckily, he was able to prove his citizenship. He was able to get out of immigration detention. But there needs to be an opportunity to have that moment to contest the arrest, contest the detention, contest the deportation. If you're a US citizen and there's not that opportunity, you're not going to get that opportunity either. So, say you're arrested, if there is no process in place to have a judge or some authority check the validity of the potential deportation, you as a US citizen could be deported, right? Like you would have the same rights in that context as anybody else, regardless of their citizenship status. And so that is a real concern. And I think it's something that people should be very worried about because it directly impacts people's own rights and it directly impacts the broader due process protections that we have and that we want to honor as a society.
Where does detainment fall in this? You're speaking to deportation and be able to contest that. What about being detained? Of course, you've heard about Alligator Alcatraz. I have people telling me there's other facilities like this being built. I guess what's due process like and just being able to avoid detention when it comes to this?
Yeah. So Alligator Alcatraz, like a lot of other detention facilities, there have been kind of tent detention camps at the border for for a long time. It's not completely separate or distinct from kind of what's been happening all along. But I think there's been a lot of hype around it, and I think that the marketing, for lack of a better word, that the government has been putting forward around it has been very particular in the way that it is prov it is kind of capturing the attention of the nation in a certain way. Um,
Is that
due
a way?
process.
Wait, I don't mean to
Sorry.
interrupt you. Is that a way to get people? I mean, if you mentioned the presentation of it, do you think, is that a way to get people to self-deport, which they have called on people to do to avoid a predicament like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of this is it is designed to scare people, and the purpose of some of it is to create a fear and encourage people to avoid potential detention in a place that is quite terrifying. I think that there's been more scrutiny of what people kind of go through in immigration detention recently, particularly around Alligator Alcatraz.
Yeah.
And I think that is good and bad because the severity of it, the kind of conditions that are pretty horrifying, are are kind of part and parcel of some of the media
Mhm.
that is being pushed by the White House.
Mhm.
But I do think that it is simultaneously driving concern from people who have legitimate concerns about people being kept in places like that.
We had a couple weeks ago, some lawmakers went down to Federal Plaza to accompany some individuals, and this alludes to something we spoke about the last time we talked about that window in the hallway where ICE agents are waiting for someone that had their case dismissed, and they can go. I was told by one of those lawmakers that they actually witnessed someone have a date set and still get taken. I mean, how does that fall in this process? How does that work?
I think one of the things that we're seeing many things, but there's a lack of predictability, and a lot of things that were outside of the normal practice, outside of the normal expectation, are now happening. So one thing that the administration changed recently as a policy is that everybody who enter the United States without inspection is required. They're not setting any bond for them. So normally, what would happen is um, you would, as a just like in any criminal jail setting, you would be have the opportunity to be released on bond, and often they're quite expensive. They're like $15,000, $10,000. It's a large amount of money is put up on these bonds. Um, and you would be able to get out of detention and go about your life. And that's important because a lot of people living in the United States may have family, they may have US citizen children, US citizen spouses, US citizen family members. And we want to make sure that those people aren't separated from their family member if there's no reason to. It's also incredibly expensive to detain people. So it's just kind of it's not good policy. Um, Instead, what's happening is there's no opportunity for them, or the administration is saying that they're not eligible for bond, which I think is a misreading of the statute and is going to be subject to quite a bit of challenge. But the kind of overall predictability of what's happening, of what we can expect from ICE, of what their policies are going to be, has really eroded. There's no predictability, or there's little predictability, and I think that is something that is of concern because it's so much up to the individual kind of frontline agent or the local offices rather than an overarching policy that is coherent and predictable.
we might have talked about this last time, but because some of the statistics have just come out in regards to some of the individuals that have been detained and deported, we've heard the administration say we're getting out the baddest, and obviously, I think no one wants someone that's committed heinous crimes anywhere, anywhere to walk free. But the statistics have shown that the majority, I believe, of the individuals that have been taken have had very low level crimes, right? Is that what you've seen too? Like it's very like petty crimes even. Like like
Yeah.
like petite larceny or like something like theft, things like that.
So under the Lake and Riley Act, anybody who's even arrested of theft for theft offense, even a very low level theft offense, is required to be mandatorily detained, which, I think is, you know, is of line with what we expect as a society and kind of like what we consider to be like something very serious. But I'm not familiar with I don't have the current stats up and I don't want to misstate them because there is some nuance there. But contrary to what the administration has been kind of putting out, the actual numbers are indicative that there's a large number, a large percentage of people who have committed no crime. There's no arrest record, and they are they are nevertheless being detained. And a large there's not that much statistical information available around the actual offenses. But generally, it is it is it's not like everybody's who's being arrested is convicted of homicide, right?
For the record, for the sake of this conversation, here's what CBS News obtained a nice document of the estimated 100,000 people who were deported between January 1st and June 24th by ICE. 70,500 were convicted criminals. However, the data shows that most of the documented infractions were traffic or immigration offenses. Less than 1% of deportees had murder convictions. So that's
Yeah.
the information that CBS News obtained. Does that align? I just now that you've heard that yourself?
Um, yeah, there's a couple different statistics and a recent FOIA release that I'm thinking of too that kind of delves into it in more specific detail. But you know, crossing the border without inspection is a misdemeanor offense, and it has a maximum sentence of 6 months. It's not considered a serious offense, and it's hasn't been prosecuted kind of traditionally broadly. Um, that is potentially going to drive a lot of those statistics, just because of the number of people who have entered without inspection.
Right. I did want to get to some of the farm worker conversation that's been going on because you've heard a lot of that from Brooke Rollins, the Trump administration as a whole. I want to get first to amnesty because there's been that discussion. Is there a process for amnesty, or is that just something that they can decide unilaterally and say, here, this group gets it, this group doesn't? How does that work?
So traditionally, registry is a process. It was last updated by Reagan back in the 80s. But there's a process in a statute that basically Congress just has to update the year. That's all they would have to do, and they would be able to grant amnesty kind of to a large number of people who have been in the United States, kind of regardless of immigration status. And that would be it would solve so many things. It would be pretty incredible. I think what it also does is it highlights that the choice to have somebody have a path to permanent immigration status or not is really it is solely based on our laws, and those laws don't necessarily have a basis in any sort of deep-seated morality. They're often driven by the economy and by need, and we can change them, right? They haven't been changed in a very long time, but we can change them. And a lot of the kind of underlying laws are somewhat arbitrary in what who they decide is eligible to stay in the United States and who isn't. Um, but it would be very simple for Congress to update that year and update that statute. And they haven't done it yet, but I think that there's hope.
What do you make of the conversations? I talked to the New York Farm Bureau earlier this week about the farm worker aspect and how they've been pushing for decades for year-long visas instead of seasonal. Can you take me inside that conversation a bit?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with the Farm Bureau's kind of position on that specific issue, but I know that um, from the farm worker perspective, um, it is a brutally laborious job. It's really difficult. It's not emotionally, it's physically taxing in a way that like very few jobs are. And it's subject to limited protection. So for instance, overtime protections are kind of slowly getting phased in New York, but that took a very long time and it still doesn't kick in for a number. I think it's like 60 hours a week. I don't quote me on that. I'm not entirely up on it.
Yeah, I know.
But
It's a process to get there. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but a lot of it's very difficult, and I mean it's not work that most US citizens or green card holders are willing to do. And so the a lot of farms rely on either kind of temporary agricultural workers where they'll have seasonal workers who are overseas who they bring in every year, or people who are undocumented. And it exposes those people who are the workers to a lot of exploitation by unscrupulous employers, just because they have so much control over their lives. And it is often a group of people who have a lot of reason to be afraid of authority and government, and so are kind of easily taken advantage of. And so I think that the one of the kind of opportunities that exists in some sort of bipartisan capacity that has been introduced multiple times, and unfortunately, I don't have the names of the lawmakers at the top of my head right now, but there have been bipartisan efforts to create some sort of farm worker pathway to citizenship. And I think that that would be a really incredible option and an opportunity. I think that extending kind of the length of the visa is, from my perspective, not necessarily any sort of it's not going to change anything. It's going to simply change the length of time somebody can stay in the United States. It's not going to change their status. It's not going to change the fundamental kind of core principles of how that visa functions. But I think offering it as an opportunity to have some sort of security, some sort of secure permanent status would do a lot to change how they are protected and how they are able to kind of survive and I think it would well I think that there's a lot that could be done there, but I think that some of those opportunities, some of those bills have been introduced multiple times over the years, and it's often between large agricultural states. So New York is a very large agricultural state. Washington is too. And so one of the lawmakers that frequently is the sponsor of that bill is from Washington State, and is a Republican. And so that's kind of an example of ways that the different factions and different parties can work together to kind of come to some sort of solution.
Yeah, there was just a bill, I think, proposed either today or yesterday, and I think in that same vein, that would provide exceptions, if you will. So you mentioned unscrupulous employers, and I know that some, as we've seen judges, we've seen others that have been either arrested or whatever under the guise of harboring or what have you. But Is there a legal path for federal agents to hold the employer accountable and say, you're bringing in these undocumented immigrants and paying them under the table. Now you're in trouble. Is there any legal grounds for that?
It would be entirely dependent on the facts of the particular situation. I can imagine a situation and a set of facts where that would be possible. But absent any sort of specific, I wouldn't want to opine too far. But yeah, I mean, in certain circumstances, that's the harboring that statute is quite broad, and it covers potentially quite a bit of conduct. Um, it hasn't been used to the kind of in some of the ways that am worried that it might be used, but it definitely is a possibility.
Yeah, so that gets us to what we talked about before we got on here was the immigration authorities asking landlords to turn over information on tenants. I guess I know I mean even the article we were talking about, I think there was that was part of the article is there's major legal questions there. What are your legal questions when it comes to that?
I mean, ICE and DHS overall are using kind of new tactics to get information on immigrants, and just people. So I think one of the things to keep in mind and that I'm always trying to kind of reiterate is that it's not just immigrants who are affected, it's everybody. So if the if the agency is asking for, all the landlord's records or records around certain people, that's going to be over-inclusive. It's going to end up handing over a lot of information about US citizens. And I personally think that that is a horrific overreach of federal authority, that I find just absolutely contrary to the core principles of what this country stands for. But I think one of the things that one of the ways that the agency that ICE has been kind of getting information um, is not necessarily legally compelled. So if you get a piece of paper from a government agency, most people's reaction is to turn records over to do that. But that, I think, with depending on what the actual documents are, depending on what the potentially administrative subpoena is that ICE is sending to landlords, that isn't necessarily legally compelled in the same way that a court order would require somebody to turn documents over. So there's, again, not that check, not that due process check. And, that is in itself a violation of the landlord's rights, right? Because they're compelling somebody to turn over documents on somebody else, but it affects everybody's rights, and it chips away the protections that we have as a society. I'm not answering your question very well, but I
No,
think one.
it gets back to the U.S. citizen thing, right? In terms of, if they're going to look into you and actually mistakenly do this to individuals that aren't immigrants, this just provides another tool in the toolbox, right? Like that's
Yeah, and it paves the way for uh, broader searches, and the putting together a lot more information on a broader set of people. Right. And I think that that's also through threat, even even if it's not articulated, it's through the kind of use of federal government power of sending somebody a document and saying, turn over these records. Like it's it is, yeah, it's not legally compelled, but it is kind of compelling somebody in some fashion to turn over their own records as well as information on somebody else.
Yeah. In the final question for this session, what else is sticking out to you right now that people should know?
Um, I think the the number of changes in policy have kind of it's come at a very fast pace recently. And some of the policy changes seem particularly they seem particularly targeted to in a way that's quite cruel. So for instance, going back to the third country removal. So again, somebody who's maybe from Honduras, and instead of being deported to Honduras, they're being deported to South Sudan. Um, the current ICE policy just kind of seems needlessly cruel. It specifically says that ICE agents may not, and that's underlined and emphasized in the actual policy. So particular ICE agents may not inquire as to whether somebody might be afraid of being tortured in that third country, right? And so that prohibition against kind of like even a very basic check of like, are you afraid to return to be deported to this place? Is there a reason where you might be tortured or killed there? Like that's particularly specifically prohibited. And I think that that's quite scary. I think simultaneously or similarly, um, the people who are very vulnerable are being targeted in particularly cruel ways. So special immigrant juvenile status, children who have been found by a family court to have been abused, neglected, or abandoned by one or more of their parents, and whose in their best interest is not to return to their country. They used to be granted kind of deferred action while they waited for a green card to apply for a green card, because there's often a gap of a couple of years between when they're granted that status and when or granted that visa and when a visa is actually available. That means that children are no longer, even though there is a court saying that we have found that it's not in their best interest to return to that country, there's now no protection from ICE against returning them to that country while they wait for a visa. So it's just kind of contradictory to kind of like what our presumptions are about how the law works. And what the fact that there is a court finding saying one thing and the administration proceeding to do the other thing, I think is quite scary about just kind of the erosion of basic legal principles.
Well, legal principles, and I mean, I don't want to editorialize, but moral. I mean, what you just described is horrible. But let's be honest, like to return a child back to a place where clearly they were traumatized, that a court found that
Yeah,
is startling.
yeah. I think there is so much cruelty that is unlike anything I've ever seen. And the policies are designed that way. That is their purpose.
Lauren, thank you for your time. We'll talk soon.
Thank you very much. Bye.